Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of LunchTalk in the community Cross Connect Your Interests to Grow. My name is Azadeh Eshaghi. I'm the initiator of this community and I'm an independent consultant and senior terminologist and also knowledge networker based in Zurich. And in this lunch talks, I talk to interesting people out of my network dealing with interesting topics worth sharing. And today I'm very happy that we have Franziska Romanovsky as our guest, and which is very interesting and very exciting for me because Franziska and I share quite a lot of things from our background. We studied both international technical communication in Magdeburg in Germany, and we graduated both in 2007. And then at that time we were also both students representatives in the faculty council, and we're still active in the field of technical communication even after 13 years. And I'm very happy to have you, Franziska, today in our lunch talk.
Hello from Mountain View. It's so good to see you, Azadeh.
Hi.
I had so many fun memories of us studying together in Magdeburg, and I'm really looking forward to our talk today.
Yeah.
I believe the last time we saw each other was in 2006, right before I moved to the US.
Right.
And so I started out in Seattle. I was working and writing my master's thesis with a translation company for a year, and they taught me the ropes of quality translations from a practical perspective. And thereafter, I moved to San Diego and worked in a couple of different roles within the localization industry before I was lucky to find my current company, EDM Translations, in Palo Alto, Silicon Valley. EDM specializes in certified translations for medical device, pharma, biomedical companies. And I'm currently the vendor relations manager there. So this includes technical recruiting, process training, and a lot of relationship building. It's really mostly about identifying common goals and building mutual beneficial partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Great. So it's very interesting because now you're we're in the same field. So we started exactly the same, I would say. We had also the same language combinations, while I was specialized in the field of terminology standardization and terminology management. You have your expertise now in the field of localization. And would you please tell our audience what is actually localization and what is the difference between localization and translation?
Well, localization is really the adaptation of a product from one language to the other with the goal to sell as many items as possible abroad by addressing the consumer or user in their native language. So I think we can agree that we all prefer buying products in our native language with user menus in our native language, and reading product descriptions in a language with which you feel the most comfortable really instills more confidence in the handling and in the maintenance of the product. So sure, there are like many people that speak several languages these days and who would not have a problem handling, like using the original description in English, let's say, but it is proven that companies can greatly increase their sales if they decide to localize the products for the people that use those products in country and make it as convenient as possible for the end user to use those materials.
Yeah, can you give some examples? So if we do, because the goal of translation is exactly the same, but what are the specific factors which are to do if you do a localization? What does it actually mean?
Sure. So I actually want to go a little bit more into detail about also the requirement to translate, because like, let's say for instance, you have a medical device and your company is planning to sell a pharma product or medical device product into a different country. That's where really when the decision to localize becomes a requirement, because you're obligated to translate and localize all of those materials.
Sure.
There are very strict rules and regulations within the field of life science. And so, I mean, it makes complete sense. Like a doctor in Iceland or France, China has to understand how to operate and apply the medical device. And there's no room for interpretation error. Like an error in this field could cause a patient's life. And for that reason, there are strict rules and regulations to avoid such an outcome at any cost. And yeah, to come back to your question, localization is not really only the translation of a product from one language to another, but it's the adaptation of all content that comes with a product. And so it can be, for instance, units of measurement. So here in the US, we use the imperial system with feet and inches, gallons, pounds, whereas in Germany and really most other countries, they use the metric system with meters, kilogram, liters. And so it's really important to keep those measurements in mind when you localize your product. Right. And convert the numbers correctly to not confuse the end user. Because if you don't create a relation between the documentation and the end user and country, then you risk that they reject your product because they cannot accept it. It doesn't make sense to them if you use measurements that don't apply to them. Yeah. And another item to think about would be, for instance, colors, images, and symbols. Mm-hmm. Some colors mean good luck in some countries. For instance, like yellow, red, and green in China have a positive connotation, whereas they might raise a red flag in other cultures. So in the Western cultures, we associate red mostly with love, but it can also mean danger. So when you localize your product, make sure that you choose the right colors that work for your product and country, and it doesn't offend anybody in that country.
But when you talk about colors, what kind of colors are you talking about? If someone has a logo, are you talking about the color in the logo, or are you talking about the corporate design, or what color are you talking about?
That's a good question. I mean, it really applies to everything everything that comes with a product, like the logo, the colors that you use in the documentation and the marketing materials. Like people have certain associations with certain colors, and it would just be wiser to pick a color that is either neutral or has a very positive connotation in a specific culture. So why would you take the risk if you have the choice? And for that reason, you should work with a specialized localization provider who can advise on those kind of items. Yeah. I was just thinking of another item, for instance, like the time format. Here in the US, we use the AM/PM method to distinguish between morning and evening hours, whereas in Germany, we use the 24-hour format, also known as military time. So if you don't want to confuse your user, it's best to localize a time format that also goes for the date format or temperature measurements like Fahrenheit and Celsius. So really your goal in localization is to relate to the user and country and make it as easy and convenient for them to connect with your product and not get confused. Mm-hmm. Or for instance, marketing speak. I think marketing speak also varies greatly from one language to another. So what's hip and trendy in one language might be offensive in another. So like the Middle Eastern cultures, for instance, are known to be more conservative than our Western cultures. And so you want to make sure that you keep, you take the local perceptions and country into account when you localize your product. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I think besides those basic facts, and there's others to consider. I'm just talking about the
Facts. For
yes.
instance, I know quite a lot of companies who want to, want to have their website for the for their clients in Switzerland, and although they have already everything in German, in Hochdeutsch, in for Germany and Austria, they say, okay, we want to adapt the language and the wording also, and everything else around the language to the Swiss German language that people use in Switzerland, because we want, if they go on our website, on our online shop or whatever, and they click around and search for a product, we want that they feel this website is provided by a Swiss company. And yeah, so this is, I think this is another very important factor. If you know, or to find out if the countries where you want to sell, or if you want to, where you want to provide your documentation or whatever, if they have some specific linguistic requirements, or other special things that you should think about and adapt.
And yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely something to consider. And there's much more to localization and translation that meets the eye. And I was just thinking of another example, for instance, what you have to consider doing localization, which really applies more to localization, is that you have to think about the order in which you localize and translate the documents or the materials that come with a product. So for instance, when your product is a software, then you have to localize the software first, and then the documentation and the marketing materials. Because as we know, the software repeats within the documentation, and otherwise you would risk a lot of rework and additional cost.
Yeah.
So it's important for your expenses and also for consistency to keep in mind that the order of localizing materials is of essence.
Yeah.
And yeah,
that's a very good point, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and if a company like is planning, for instance, to sim ship, or to when time to market in general is essential, then basically your challenges as a language service provider just multiplied, because of course it's more difficult to like manage multiple translation and desktop and localization engineering teams at the same time when they localize into several languages at the same time. So yeah, but on the other hand, it can have the advantage, as the linguists tend to ask very helpful questions during the localization process, and all of those answers to those questions might actually apply to the other languages as well. So this can be shared across the board, and it can be beneficial to the translation process in general to also do it at the same time. But it's more challenging for the language service provider.
Yeah.
And yeah, I believe what we want to also take a closer look at, and what's really one of the leading principles in like keeping the customer happy, is really ensuring consistency. So I think consistency is a positive trait in many regards, but it really is literally the foundation of a successfully localized product.
Yeah, exactly. Consistency is so important. We have to think of many different items when it comes to consistency of documentation and the translation and the multilingual communication, actually. And what you said with consistency is indeed very important. For instance, we have the terminology, the wording we use in the communication, it has to be consistent. So this is more my field, where I'm very active in that. So the terminology standardization. So it is important if you have, for instance, your website, and you have your contracts and your technical documentation and your marketing publications, whatever it is, flyers, brochures, everything you have to we have to take care that the communication is consistent, so that we don't confuse our clients, and that the clients know exactly, okay, if I use part X something and I go to the website, I will, if for instance, if I have the manual, if I open the manual and I see, okay, there is this part in with the name XYZ, and then they go to the website and to the online shop and they want to have exactly that part, they want to order it, they have to find this item with exactly the same word they found in the manual or in some other documentation they have already. So this is very important. And what a lot of people don't know is there is a whole machinery with translation memories, with terminology databases, with
tools.
A lot of tools that work together, and that translation agencies who work on a high level use these tools to improve the quality, and also to reduce the costs and to be more efficient in producing the translations. And
yeah, it's true. Yeah, like as you're basically building a company's reputation in another language, there are several tools at your disposal as a language service provider to help ensure that consistency. So one of the most basic tools is really the TM, the translation memory, the glossary, style guide, term bases, CAT tools, computer aided translation tools. It can go as far as like using a TMS, translation management system, potentially a CMS that connects with your TMS. CMS is a content management system, or even maybe a DITA-enabled content management system, but that's taken it way further. So it really depends on your needs as a company, which route you want to go. And I feel what's most important is that you pick a language service provider that can help guide you and is an honest partner in this process. So that really like finds a customized solution for you, and like focuses on your needs, and not trying to sell your product that might not be beneficial to your process, for instance, or to your products in particular. So for instance, like if you have documents like medical records or master batch records, those are like usually very formatting heavy, also come in PDF format. So those kind of documents might not necessarily benefit from a TMS, and might be better to handle those manually. Whereas like companies like Apple or Amazon that have like tons of content to localize would probably be better off sending it through a TMS connected to a CMS, because they want to reuse their content over and over and create a consistent image between the different versions of their product. Like for instance, the iPhone, there have been like several versions of the iPhone out there. And so Apple really wants to make sure to reuse the documentation to instill this image of, to instill the feeling of consistency and familiarity with the product. For the iPhone, for instance, only a few features change over time, but most of the documentation would actually remain the same. So it's better for them also, in order to achieve the cost savings through using the TM, to
memory.
take advantage of all those options. And maybe you should talk a little bit more about the translation memory in general, what it is.
I think we should explain to our audience what translation memory actually is. The fact is that people often think when we talk about translation memory or automated tools, they think that it's a machine doing the work. So if they hear, okay, the agency or translator is using a tool, then they think, okay, this is not human work anymore. And that's actually wrong, because it's still a human being behind this tool and is really doing the whole work of translation. By him or his own. But the point is that the translation memory saves each sentence in the both languages. That means in the original language and in the target language. They save these two sentences together. And if the client once again wants to translate exactly the same sentence or same segment, we also say, then the translator doesn't need to translate it once again. So the tool picks up this translation out of the translation memory and reuses it. And that means that the client and also the translator, you save a lot of time. And of course, also the client saves a lot of money. And as soon as there is a little change, then the client benefits from the memory, because that tool shows the translator, okay, look, here is a fuzzy match, and there is a fuzzy match with, I don't know, let's say 89% match, and you can use that. And what the translator does is that he picks just this option, which the tool shows him, and adapts it. And it is saved once again. So the second translation or the second version is again memorized in this translation memory. So see that it's always human work, but with the help of this tool, we achieve a kind of
consistency and cost savings, really, right?
And also cost saving, yeah. And then if the translator has also the terminology which is to be used, he can use that as well during his work. So you can combine in this CAT tool, computer-aided translation tool, you can combine different databases together so that the translator uses the right terminology and uses always already existing translations and adapts them to the new requirements.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's really a huge machinery behind the whole translation process. And I want to come back to also to updating the source at this point, because that can also impact the savings. So for instance, when a company decides to localize their products, is just as important to keep the source consistent. So for instance, there's a specific role for that, like the technical writer who creates all the content and updates it and has the knowledge on how to do this correctly. So like we talked about earlier, like with the segments, like just with a small punctuation change within a sentence, 100% match may turn into a fuzzy match, which is then charged at a higher rate. So creating and maintaining the source in a consistent way is just as important as consistent translations eventually, because that also helps you to achieve cost savings. So if you keep the source consistent, otherwise, if you change the punctuation, let's say a period to a colon or adding commas somewhere, it changes the match.
Sometimes you write one time in in bold, and the other time it's not in bold. It's I don't know, it's another font even. Then you have already lost some percentage of matching. So that means losing money in the process, right? It's very important to say. I mean, there are of course, a lot of other requirements to make sure that the translation can be done very smoothly. And I think another point which is also very important to mention is that not only consistency in the source document has to be in what you said with the punctuation and so on, colors, fonts and so on, but also the terminology should be consistent, because if the terminology in the source document is consistent, you can it is possible to to have a consistent translation in the other language. It's also important that the source document is clear, so that the sentences or the expression in the text is really clear and understandable, not only for other experts who read it, but also for the translator who has maybe no clue about the topic, about the technology. And we have also to keep in mind that very often we have documentation about a very new technology where we cannot expect that the translator has a huge knowledge about that, or where the translator can do a lot of research, because there is nothing existing about that topic and right now. So the source documents or texts have to be really clear and understandable, so that the translation is easier to do also.
Yeah, true.
Franziska, before we talked about translation memories, and that the client can save a lot of time and money and cost, of course, if the translator or the translation agency uses translation memories.
Mm-hmm.
Can you please explain how it comes that as a client we would save money?
Sure. So I think another good example to explain that in a more practical manner would once again be like, for instance, Apple, the product of the iPhone. So there's several generations out there, and they've already previously translated this content several times. So each time the client submits a source file that has very similar content to the previously translated content, the client achieves those cost savings. So basically, the more similar the source of the previous generation iPhone is to the source of the next generation iPhone, the more cost savings there can be achieved. Because in our industry, we basically categorize matches according to the percentage in which they overlap. So for instance, it can be repetitions, like a sentence that repeats in exactly the same way, or it can be lower fuzzies, higher fuzzies. Like I said, it depends on the percentage in which the previous source and the current source overlap. Mm-hmm. So it's like I said before, it's really important for the client to keep the source as consistent as possible and take advantage of that pricing system that the localization industry has in place, in order to not only achieve the consistency, but also the cost savings.
Yeah. And so in other words, that means if I have now a text that has to be translated for the first time, and 1 year later, I have a very similar, or actually the same document with some changes if I let it translate once again, so that the second time I don't pay the whole price for the whole translation of the whole text, but only for the differences. And the more I work with a translator or with a translation memory with the same database, the more I save money, because the translation memory fills up more and more with my content that I can use again and again. So I can reuse it and save therefore money. And yeah, this is very important. And another thing which is important for clients is that they know about this technology, and they really require it when they work together with a translation agency or with a translator, that they say, hey, I want you to use this translation memory tool.
Yeah. And really, as a language service provider, you should be proactive about it and like guide them and say, like, let them know about all the options that are out there for them to save, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a language service provider's obligation to share all that information.
The point is that in the reality shows that translation agencies not necessarily always tell their clients about these technologies, although they use it and although they, on their side, save the money and the time. But some of these translation agencies, when they see, okay, my client has no idea about these tools existing and I can make a little bit more money, so then they hide it. And therefore I always try to tell my clients that, okay, if you work together with a translation agency, make sure that they use it, that they use these tools, and that they give you the discounts on your in your invoices. So it's very important for clients to know that these technologies exist, and that also professional translation agencies really use them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, and I feel like it wouldn't really set off the partnership on the right foot if you were to hide such information. I mean, it doesn't sound like a very trusting way to begin a collaboration. And yeah, which really brings us to the next question that we were thinking about. What are really your recommendations for like customers that are looking for language services? Like, what should they keep in mind? And I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is really like pick an honest service provider. Pick somebody who can provide guidance, or who is willing to share.
You have no idea who is honest and who's not. So you know, it's easy to say choose a translation agency who is honest. If you have,
I think you can get a good. I think you can get a good impression by just having a few conversations. Like for instance, when let's say your company is looking to sell like software in a different country, and if you really want to make sure that your language service provider has expertise in that field, then you have a certain set of questions in mind, like can they help with analyzing my source files? Are my source files internationalized to allow for localization? Like what will the linguistic verification look like after the software has been localized and then put in context? So there are a couple of guiding questions that you can use in order to determine whether this language service provider is a good fit for you.
What I suggest to my clients usually is to create, so we create together in a workshop or in a session together a checklist for them. So, and with this checklist, there are far more categories of questions about many different items they can ask to find out, and it's actually like an audit. So whether my client does it himself with this checklist, or I do it as an auditor. And so with this checklist, you can really make sure that if you're talking to some different, also if you're talking to evaluate some different translation agencies, that you don't forget some important questions, so that your evaluation between 2 or 3 different agencies is comparable. Because sometimes it happens that you have a conversation or an interview with one translation agency, and then you gather some information, and then if you talk with someone else and you're not a professional auditor in this field, then maybe you forget some of those points, and then you ask some other points, and at the end, if you want to compare them, you cannot compare them actually, because you don't have the information on an equal level. So for that reason, and also for some other reasons, I suggest to create a fitting checklist. And first of all, you have to have a list of your requirements. So after you know your requirements, you're able to set up a checklist. And then starting from there and interviewing them and talking to them, or going into their office if it's possible, and depending on the project you have. If you have big translation projects, it's worth it to really push the translation agency and to say, hey, show me how you work, show me your quality documents, show me your quality assurance, show me your tools. I want to see what you do, because we will pay a lot of money for a lot of translation. And it is necessary to know exactly what you want. And after that, you can ask for the right questions. Yeah, this is what I suggest, or what I do if I help my clients to find the right translation agency or language service provider.
Yeah.
But I think later maybe I can put some links with some documents or some articles helping on that. If you have something, Franziska, you can also share. If you have some helping links with documents or articles, feel free to share.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it was very interesting to talk about this translation machinery and how all these things actually work and what is behind the translation nowadays. Not only nowadays, these are technologies that exist for 20 years. This is nothing very new, but nowadays a lot of translation agencies, most of the translation agencies and translators, even freelance translators, use these tools, and clients should be aware of that to really benefit from these technologies. So thanks again, Franziska. It was very, very cool to talk to you. It was very interesting. Thanks for your contribution. And I hope that we talk to each other very soon again.
It was a pleasure, Azadeh. Thank you for having me. And I hope we were able to shed some light on the localization translation industry. And like you said, like if anybody has questions, they can reach out to us and find out more.
Comments under the link of the video, and that we will answer. So thanks a lot for watching. Thanks a lot for this lunch talk together, Franziska, and have a great rest of the day, and bye-bye.
Same to you, Azadeh. Thank you.
Bye.